You're listening to BFM 89.9, the business station.
Today on Current Affairs, we begin the three-part Millennium Development Goals 2010 series with Kamal Malhotra, United Nations Resident Coordinator for Malaysia and UNDP Representative for Malaysia, Singapore and Brunei. So what are these Millennium Development Goals? Well, the MDGs are a product of the UN's Millennium Declaration of 2000, which is for the first time in world history that 189 world leaders have agreed to concentrate on achieving 8 time-bound goals to be achieved by 2015.
The first MDG is about poverty, and one of the targets in the first MDG is to halve the proportion of people whose income is less than $1 a day. So First of all, just how poor are the poor in Malaysia? How far has Malaysia met this target?
Well, the poor in Malaysia, as one would expect in a upper middle income country, are not as poor as the poor in the poorest parts of the world. However, when you disaggregate, there are some pockets of entrenched poverty in Malaysia which are fairly deep-rooted, and where the levels and depth of poverty is quite high. In aggregate terms, overall, Malaysia has achieved the MDG objective of halving poverty, which fell from 17% in 1990 to 8% in 2000 and was below 4% in 2009. However, when you disaggregate, as our report does, we find that rural Sabah in particular is not on track to achieve the poverty MDG by 2015. And in Sabah as a whole, not rural Sabah, the poverty rate was 30.4% in 1990, and it's now down to about 20%, 19.7% in 2009. That's for Sabah as a whole, but rural Sabah poverty rates are still in excess of 30%. So you can say that it's very uneven. And the other point I would like to make here is the poverty line in Malaysia is sensitive to small changes. So there is a very large percentage of the population just above the poverty line. And so if you were to change the poverty line and increase it by a slight amount, you would find fairly significant numbers falling into poverty.
I would think that using a poverty threshold could be problematic because if you have income which is marginally above, it's not that substantially different from having income marginally below it, right?
That is correct, which is why in the 10th Malaysia Plan, the government has targeted, the bottom 40%, because it recognizes that a significant 40% of Malaysian households still earn less than 2,300 ringgit a month. And when you break that, you divide that by 30, you'll get, the rate per day. And so there's a very significant amount of the population just above that threshold, and for them, it's a little meaningless to define an arbitrary poverty line.
Like you mentioned earlier, the MDG 2010 report has found that the poverty rate in Sabah is the highest in the country. So how is it that Sabah, which has only 10% of Malaysia's population, has over 30% of the poverty-stricken?
The poverty rate for Sabah is the highest in the country, as I said. And rural poverty did decline in Sabah from 35% in 1990 to some extent. But to meet the target by 2015, it would have required an average annual decline of 2.8% per year from 1990, or almost 5% per year from 2007. And that seems very difficult to achieve given the current trend. And so we have concluded that it is not going to be possible for rural Sabah to meet the MDG target for 2015 because we have just under 5 years left. This is surprising and disappointing because for an upper middle income country like Malaysia, one would expect that the poverty MDG would not be or should not be an issue.
But Sabah is abundant with natural resources. Is this a question of inclusiveness?
Yeah, I think there's a mix of factors, but certainly I don't want to downplay issues of geographic terrain, which pose severe limitations to building transport infrastructure and basic amenities. But I think that there are significant issues which have to do with the relationships between eastern Malaysia and the federal Malaysia in terms of the resources and how they're utilized from Sabah and Sarawak. Also, what we found is that in 2009, the contribution of the category known as Other Bumiputra to total poor households in poverty was well above the 9 or 10% of total households. For example, the incidence of poverty amongst the other Bhumiputra, many of whom live in Sabah and Sarawak, increased from 14% in 2007 to 17% in 2009. Also in 2009, the intensity of poverty was most visible amongst the other Bhumiputra. We find that the population which is overrepresented amongst the poor is also, very significantly represented in Sabah.
Well, speaking about income inequality, last year the World Bank was reported to have said that the bulk of inequality today can be explained by differences in socioeconomic factors within ethnic groups rather than across them. So how far do you agree with this statement?
Yeah, let me start by saying that inequality and relative poverty remain amongst the most urgent challenges that Malaysia continues to face, because inequality in Malaysia has remained stubborn and has stabilized at a pretty high rate. For the Asia-Pacific region, Malaysia has one of the highest levels of inequality. Now, while inequality between ethnic groups has reduced over the last 30-40 years, and I would agree with the World Bank that a major focus should really be on intra-ethnic group inequality, but I do want to note the following facts. It is true that from 1989 to 2009, the incidence of poverty among all ethnic groups fell quite considerably. But as I said, when you then break it down, you find that within the Bhumiputra group, it's the other Bhumiputra who live predominantly in East Malaysia who are disproportionately represented still. And so I would focus particularly on if you're looking at ethnic groups, certainly looking at the Malay and the Bhumiputra ethnic group and looking within it and putting a focus particularly on other Bhumiputra, I think would be most useful at this point, particularly if you're talking about the rural areas. If you're talking about the urban areas, our report finds that it is likely that urban poverty may have, if you like, from an ethnic point of view, a sort of Indian face to a considerably greater extent than another ethnic face. So again, it depends on whether you're looking at rural or whether you're looking at urban.
What are the key differences between rural and urban poverty that you talk about? Can you give us some specifics?
Well, of course, in the urban areas, we find that women are overrepresented, and that the urban face of poverty, is likely to be more a woman. That women are more likely. Urban female-headed households in 2009 had a higher probability of being poor than urban male-headed households, and also rural female-headed households. And secondly, that, again, the issues of urban poverty are quite different. And we do find that within ethnic groups, it would be useful to focus particularly on the Indian population in the urban areas. But in the rural areas, one would focus very much more on other Bhumiputra. But overall, yes, I think the time has come to focus on relative poverty within ethnic groups rather than across ethnic groups.
I find it interesting. You said that urban female-headed households had a higher probability of being poor than urban-headed male households and then rural female-headed households. So why exactly is that? What's causing this disparity?
Well, I think there are a number of factors here at play. And of course, this represents a change from 1989, when rural but not urban female-headed households had a higher probability of being poor than male-headed households. I'd single out 2 or 3 issues in particular. One is, of course, we find that those in the urban area, women are likely to have primary education or less, and they're outside the formal labor force. And this, I think, is one of the factors. The other is that we have more single mother-headed households, and we find that single mother-headed households are likely to be more poor and more vulnerable than male-headed households. So this access to education or lack of it, access to formal employment in the labor force or lack of it, as well as the